closed or open or?
Doesn't matter, whatever you like.
Anybody's here tonight.
Everybody needs to be able to say anything.
Oh, I forgot.
All right, well, glad everybody's here tonight. Numbers are a little few, but we'll get by and hopefully we'll learn something. We are going to be talking about the Cowboy tonight. So,
Yeehaw.
yeah. So anyway, let's see, this is the first time I've done a PowerPoint. I had a lot of fun with it. Not a whole lot
Really?
of
First
slides,
time?
but
Good for you.
anyway. So, oh, looks like I have something, maybe got into the wrong program. For those that don't know, I'm a dentist. And so sometimes I bring my work with me, and so I brought this slide tonight. What do you see in that slide?
Cavity.
A cavity,
Fillings.
fillings,
A hole.
Somebody needs
a
braces.
hole, somebody needs braces. What
The
else
way
do
the
you see?
teeth are moving.
Teeth are moving. That's a good observation. Why
Caps.
are the teeth moving?
Chewing.
Chewing?
Because there's
Part
nothing
of
in
it.
place there. There's nothing in place there. There's something that's missing without a foundation.
Yeah.
Some of
That's
us,
right.
some of us grind our teeth in our sleep.
So, when these teeth first came in this individual's mouth, there was a tooth this size right here.
Oh.
And everything lined up just like cogs in the gear, you know, and everything was really nice. The bite was right, but this tooth was lost for some reason. And these just kind of fell over, and they're not nearly as efficient as they were when that tooth was in. Plus, because of this situation here, these teeth are much more vulnerable. It's a lot easier to get food in here and plaque build up there and get decay here, and then ultimately have to have that restored or extracted. So what can we learn from that?
I need a dentist.
We need each other, don't we? We need each other. Remember Jim's illustration with the rope and how we sat down, and we couldn't have done that without each other. And this illustrates the same thing, that without you guys, without us being together and supporting each other, encouraging each other, we stand alone, and we might not do so well. We may slump over a little bit, not be as efficient, and be more vulnerable. So, just an illustration from a dentist here. Okay, so we're talking about the Cowboy stage. Just to review a little bit, last week we talked about the beloved son. Remember that? And we had some interesting comments about our youth and our relationships with our fathers. Some were pretty good, and some were not so good. And we remember those times. Well, now we're going to talk about the Cowboy stage. Few points here, key points of the Cowboy stage. We're talking about the age of around early adolescence, around 12 or 13, usually going into the mid-20s. Now, that's not to say that we can't start our Cowboy stage early. You know, we see some young boys that are pretty wild and starting their adventures and so forth. And it can also go on into midlife, and those of us who are near retirement or in retirement, we can still have some of those cowboy experiences. But that's typically about where it is. It answers the question of, do I have what it takes? And we talked about in the beloved son and growing up and just this whole idea of, do I have what it takes to be a man? And I think it goes beyond that too, because I think there comes a time when we know we have what it takes to become a man or to be a man, but there are a lot of things in life that we find out that we don't have what it takes. And that may be okay. A certain career path that that's not me. So, I'm maybe had enough experience, and I smart enough, wise enough to realize that let somebody else do that. I can't do that. and then to find out what it takes to do what I can do, or be what I can be. So those are the kinds of things, the questions that we ask when we go through this cowboy stage. It may not just what it takes to be a man. It might be what it takes to do, like I said, a certain job. It may be what it takes to be married to this woman. Maybe I don't have what it takes. Okay, so those kinds of questions. We may still have something to prove, but even at our age, we need to remember that we can presume falsely that we are past this stage. But God may have some things for us that were missed, lost, or stolen along the way. And I think we need to be open that even at whatever age we are, God has more for us. Also, be aware of the way God was present in your past and how memories of events, seasons, people, projects, hardships, and joys affirm how much God has done. And God uses other men in our lives. I was reminded as I studied this, speaking of having other men in our lives, many of you know Wayne Butler. Wayne was here for years and recently moved down to southern Pennsylvania, or Maryland, forget, anyway, he's gone. And it was 25 years ago that Wayne and I went to Florida, to Merritt Island, to watch our 14-year-old sons leave for Africa. They were with Teen Missions. And they had a commissioning that they actually invited family to come down and watch that. You watch them be commissioned, then you watch them march on the bus and go to Miami to take a flight to wherever they're going. And they went to Africa, which is an adventure in and of itself, which is what we're talking about here tonight. Anyway, Wayne and his wife was ill at the time. He took his daughter and I took my wife, and we stayed with at a place in Florida where our friends had owned that allowed us to stay there. And we got up one morning and Wayne said, "Okay, Ken, get your sneakers on." I said, "Really? Why do you want me to get my sneakers on?" So we're going for a run. I said, "Really? I don't like to run." So anyway, we went out and I don't know, a couple miles. We ran a couple miles. And, next morning we got up. He said, "Okay, get your sneakers on again. We're going running again." So we went running. So that weekend, then we came back. We came home. And the next week he said, "Now I want to see you at the rec center Monday morning at 6 o'clock. We're going to play basketball." And at the time there was a group of men that were playing basketball twice a week at the rec center. And so started playing basketball. And Wayne is gone, but that has continued on to this day. I'm still involved in early morning basketball. And without Wayne pursuing me and encouraging me in that way, I probably would not have had that adventure, and I call that an adventure, and still able to do that. So anyway, just an example of how we can encourage each other. We learn by doing. How many like to read books? We have readers in here? Like 3, maybe 3.5, less than half. I'm not a reader. My dad was disappointed I wasn't a reader. He wanted me to read. He encouraged me. He made me read. And maybe that's one of the reasons I hate to read. But I don't like, I read when I have to, and I read some books, but I just would rather be out doing something than reading a book. How many read directions? Like to read directions? Even fewer hands. Because we learn by doing. We want to do stuff. OJT, on the job training. That's how we learn.
I'll raise my hand there.
Okay. That's part of the cowboy stage. Life is hard. How many would agree that life is hard? Should have every hand up now. Why is life hard?
Because sin was introduced.
Okay, sin was introduced. If somebody has it, can look it up. Genesis 3, 17 to 19. And And we find in those verses pretty much a promise that life is gonna be hard. Anybody have that?
3:17?
Read, 17 to 19.
It's God speaking, and he says, 17 to 19, right? To Adam he said, because you listened to your wife, oh boy, that's a bad start there, isn't it? Because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Though through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return.
So that pretty much says it, that we're gonna have some hard work ahead of us.
It's okay to listen to your wife, but he said, here, you listen to your wife instead of me. That's what God's saying.
Yeah. So, as the book says, suck it up and learn to work. It's pretty blunt, and we can talk more about that later. The cowboy's heart is wounded if no adventure and if no confidence building experience. So like we said before, the cowboy really represents adventure and hard work. Confidence building experience. All work and no adventure, that's abuse. All adventure, no work. I think in the night the book illustrator talked about the guys that get into skiing and snowboarding, and they head west. They get a menial job at the ski slope, and they're ski bum for a number of years.
I know a lot of them.
All adventure, and you don't have to do, it's not necessarily just on the ski slopes or have to do with skis, but we can get carried away in our cowboy years and that stage of all the adventure, enjoy the adventure, and not really get serious about work and move on with life. Got a couple of biblical examples of men who we hear a little bit about, we read a little bit about the cowboy stage that they went through, and believe it or not, Jesus is one of those examples. And so if you would, yeah, there we go. If you can look up these scripture verses, I think we can, even things that aren't written about Jesus, I think we can figure some things out about his childhood, his boyhood, and even some, maybe a little bit of adventure that he had. Talking specifically about when they went to Jerusalem.
When he was 12 years old, and then he bailed, and he stayed, and his parents bailed on him.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't figure he was anywhere around for like 3 days.
Right. Somebody has that. You start Luke 2 on verse 39, read the 52.
When they had completed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. The boy grew up and became strong, filled with wisdom, and God's grace was on him. Every year his parents traveled to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When he was 12 years old, they went up according to the custom of the festival. After those days were over, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming he was in the traveling party, they went a day's journey. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple complex, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all those who heard him were astounded at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked them. "Didn't you know that I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother kept all these things in her heart, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and with people.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, as I read that and in context with the study we're doing, yeah, how could his parents go a whole day and not know where their son was? And in looking a little bit further into some commentaries, when these people traveled to Jerusalem, they traveled with families and a lot of people in their town. There was a big group of people. And typically the women and the children would be in the front and set the pace. And the men and the older children would be in the back. And I'm thinking that, Jesus with some of his friends are probably running, from one end to the other and maybe even going out into the wilderness a little bit and then coming back and kind of doing their own thing. And that was okay with their parents. And I think one thing we learned about Jesus' mother was she wasn't an overprotective mom. If she was, I don't think they would have been coming home and not knowing where Jesus was until after the end of day one. So I think on the way down, that's just the way they did it, and that's the way it was. And he probably had some adventure with his buddies on the trip. And then of course, then once they got there, it's interesting that they were, I think, a day's journey back. That they went back to get him, and it took 3 days to find him. So does that mean it took 2 days in Jerusalem to find their son? And the last place they looked was in the temple. Anyway, it's just kind of an interesting thing that I'd never really thought about before. But he was probably a pretty typical young man, young boy, and liked to have some fun with his friends. We know Jesus worked with his dad, the carpenter, in his carpenter shop. What kind of carpenter do you think he was? You think he ever cut himself? But I imagine he learned by doing. I imagine he worked right next to his dad. I don't know how many of you guys have done projects next to your dad, but that's a great way of learning how to do it. Someone find Matthew 15:29. I think give us some insight as to some of the things that Jesus might have done before he got to the point of having his ministry. Anybody have that?
Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down.
Several times in Scripture we hear of Jesus getting away, going into the mountains or whatever. Probably that was not his first experience of doing that. And my guess is when he was a younger man, he probably had experience going out into the woods, up into the mountains, and so that I think was I think he was adventurous in that way, that he got out and he did some things. Probably not by himself, maybe with some of his buddies. But he was familiar with the wilderness, with the mountains. So we certainly have him as an example. David did some crazy things in his cowboy stage. My perception of David from when I was younger, days past, was that he was a shepherd, and he kind of, what do shepherds do? They stand around and take care of their sheep. But he had some pretty crazy experiences. In 1 Samuel 17, just look down through there and see some of the things he did before he met Goliath.
Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons. In Saul's time, he was old and well advanced in years. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah.
Actually, you don't need to read the whole thing,
All right.
Sylvester. Doesn't it talk in there
Okay,
somewhere
you
about,
know.
about wild animals?
Mm.
You ever wonder how he did that? How do you kill it? I mean, it did say, I think that's where it said it was a young lion, or maybe that was Samson had the young lion, but I don't know if I'd want to be, attack and kill a young lion. But he killed lions and bears. So shepherds, I guess they're a lot tougher than we think they are. Has anyone ever heard of Cliff Young from Australia?
No.
Just happened to hear that while I was preparing this. It's really interesting. I thought I'd read it. It gives you some insight as how tough a shepherd can be. Every year, Australia hosts 543.7 mile endurance racing from Sydney to Melbourne. It's considered among the world's most grueling ultramarathons. The race takes 5 days to complete and is normally only attempted by world-class athletes who train specially for the event. These athletes are typically less than 30 years old and backed by large companies such as Nike. In 1983, a man named Cliff Young showed up at the start of this race. Cliff was 61 years old and wore overalls and work boots. To everyone's shock, Cliff wasn't a spectator. He picked up his race number and joined the other runners. The press and other athletes became curious and questioned Cliff. They told him, "You're crazy, there's no way you can finish this race." To which he replied, "Yes, I can. See, I grew up on a farm where we couldn't afford horses or tractors, and the whole time I was growing up, whenever the storms would roll in, I'd have to go out and round up the sheep. Sometimes I would have to run those sheep for 2 or 3 days. It took a long time, but I'd always catch them. I believe I can run this race." When the race started, the pros quickly left Cliff behind. The crowds and television audience were entertained because Cliff didn't even run properly. He appeared to shuffle. Many even feared for the old farmer's safety. All the professional athletes knew that it took about 5 days to finish the race. In order to compete, one had to run about 18 hours a day and sleep the remaining 6 hours. The thing is, Cliff Young didn't know that. When the morning of the second day came, everyone was in for another surprise. Not only was Cliff still in the race, he had continued jogging all night. Eventually, Cliff was asked about his tactics for the rest of the race. To everyone's disbelief, he claimed he would run straight through to the finish without sleeping. Cliff kept running. Each night, he came a little closer to the leading pack. By the final night, he had surpassed all of the young world-class athletes. He was the first competitor to cross the finish line, and he set a new course record. When Cliff was awarded the winning prize of $10,000, he said he didn't know there was a prize and insisted that he didn't enter for the money. He ended up giving all of his winnings to the other runners. Anyway, that's kind of an interesting story about this guy, but he worked on the farm. He was a shepherd, and he would run around and gather all these sheep up, and I'm assuming that David did some similar things like that. He was a tough man, and by the time he met Goliath, of course, he had God's blessing, and God ordained his fight with Goliath. But he also had a pretty good background of having some adventure and hard work.
How long was that race, Ken? You mentioned at the beginning.
5 days, I think it took him.
Was
5 days, and that could be a 5K for me.
What's that? I'm sorry?
That could be a 5K for me.
Okay, and hard work. Talks about learning to work hard, and looking back and reading this, looking back on my life with adventure and hard work, I was fortunate enough to have some pretty good adventures, but I also learned to work hard. And I just wanted to show you a couple of slides, because I was able to get a couple of slides up here, pictures. Anybody know what that is?
Is it tobacco?
What?
Tobacco?
That's tobacco.
Yeah.
Yeah, I grew up in southern Ohio, and when my brother and I were in junior high, my father, who was a physician, had some patients who were farmers. And he got jobs for my brother and I to work in the summers. And we worked, we did other things besides tobacco, but this is probably one of the hardest jobs that we did. And that's called spearing the tobacco. Once the tobacco is cut, we took these little metal spearheads, put them on lath, and then you actually put the stalks on this lath, which is very heavy, and you put those up on the wagon, and then you take the wagons to the barn, and you hang the tobacco up on these rails. And it was quite an experience, but that's where we learned to work, one of the places we learned to work, and we worked hard. So anyway, what we want to do now is get in our small group and share some of our adventures and some of our experiences with work and how that got us to where we are today. Maybe some of our regrets, but some of our successes too. So at this point, let's get into our small group and we'll look at the questions.